This is Joan Walseth Purcell, and I'm talking with Joanne Culbertson Jeffres on May 10th, 2022 at about 5:10. First, let me thank you for adding to the oral history collection of the Washakie Museum and Cultural Center located in Worland, Wyoming. We have two goals. First, that our class of 1960 tells what life was like for kids and teenagers in Worland from about 1941 to 1960. The second goal is that we share how growing up in Worland impacted our adult lives. So what was there another name that people called you beside Joanne?
Yes, my first name is actually Sally. I was named after my mother, whose name is actually Selma, but they called her Sally. And I always went by Joanne or Joni.
Okay, where are you right now when you're making this recording?
Currently, I'm living in Riverton, Wyoming, which is probably a little over 90 miles from Worland. And prior to that, we had lived out on a farm out of Pavilion. We farmed around 350 acres and milked 100 cows and raised our three daughters. Bob and I were married in 1968. So we have made it over 50 years now, going for more. And our three daughters are grown. We're blessed to have our eldest daughter, Lynette, who was named after her grandfather, living here in Riverton. She is an accountant and has a tax and accounting service. Our middle daughter, Roberta, is named after her dad, and she is lives in Mitchell, Nebraska with her husband, Larry Fagler, and works at Platte Valley National Bank. And our youngest daughter, Carla, is married to Grady Shear, and they live just outside of Pittsburgh and have 4 young children.
Where were you born? Were you born in Worland or someplace else?
Yes, no, I was born in Worland and have lived there my entire life till I went to college, and came home for a couple of summers after that. And once I left to start teaching, I haven't been back except to visit. But my parents were there very early and lived in the same house. And the only thing we ever changed one time was bedrooms. My mother couldn't stand us picking at each other. I have one sister and we were very close, but you know how sisters are. So they moved us from the main floor to the upstairs. They refinished the upstairs and the attic, and that was our bedroom. What I remember growing up. And my sister Marilyn is a nurse, or is retired now, but she was in Lander, Wyoming for many years.
How did it happen that your family was in Worland?
My family has a long history in Worland. When Worland was developed and they started bringing water to the farmers and they were building canals and opening up, there was a lot of homesteads being offered. And I don't know the exact reason. I wish I had written more of this down, but my dad's aunt, Mary Wood Culbertson, and Helen Coburn, or Helen Howell later after she married, and I believe it was Ashley, were young ladies that were very adventuresome, and they took a stagecoach and came out to Worland, 2 young single women in the early 1900s, and they homesteaded. And I believe the homesteads were given by luck of the draw, and they had a homestead north of Worland, 13 miles, and they built a house which crossed the line of the 2 homesteads so they could live together, but the house was an improvement on both homesteads. Wow. And I thought that was rather unique. But if you imagine 13 miles out in horse and buggy time was quite a jaunt. And then, but Aunt Mary was in Worland when it was still on the west side of the river. And during the winter, when the river was frozen and they had developed and the railroad was coming to town and it was on the east side of the river, they moved the town and all the buildings across the frozen river over to the east side where it is now. And so she was there at that time, and her brother, my Aunt Mary had a brother, Roger, and he also came out, and they're from a very old family back in Iowa. And he came out and he was part of developing the canal system in Worland. And Aunt Mary had taught there and worked in the community, also worked as county treasurer for years. And I believe she had worked with your grandfather, Alex Haley, for a while. And she moved back to St. Louis, gosh, probably in the late 40s. And she passed away in 1950, I believe, in St. Louis with pneumonia. And
so when did your father and mother get there?
well, my dad was in a family that he was the third, William Lynn Culbertson the third, and his grandfather was had been in the service and also a banker from Carroll, Iowa. And his father was William Lynn Culbertson II at that time, and he was also a commander in the Navy and with a ship of his own. And both of them are now buried in Annapolis, for what that is worth. But my dad, having been the son of a military man at that time and a stepmother, he was shifted a lot to his grandmother, Ruth Culbertson, and Aunt Mary, and they basically raised him. And so when Aunt Mary was out in Worland, I believe my dad got there in the early 30s. He had been in the service, the Navy, in the Second Nicaragua campaign. And he was out in Worland, and he had been there many times, but he stayed out there and helped them. And my mother was a nurse, and she was raised in Burlington, Iowa, Madison, Wisconsin, and Burlington, Iowa. Her parents were first generation immigrants when they were 16 and 17 my grandfather was from Sweden and my grandmother was from Norway. And they met when they got here, both spoke very little English. And my grandfather eventually ended up teaching at a junior college. And my grandmother worked as a housekeeper or for other people and just a homemaker. And my grandmother had two living brothers. One was killed when he was real young. And they were both lifers in the service. So we have a very military background. Uncle Harold was my mother's brother, was a commander of the Iowa National Guard and also postmaster there in Burlington. And my Uncle Bob had been injured in the service and worked as a recruiter until he retired. And then Uncle Harold's sons were both in the service. So, yeah. And mother came out. Mother was a nurse and she went to school at Northwestern. And she and Katie, and I'm embarrassed to say I can't think of Katie's last name, decided they wanted to do something really interesting. So at that time, flying was just coming into vogue, and you had to be a registered nurse to be a stewardess. And so they decided that they would be one of the first ones, and mother was among the young first stewardesses they had on those planes. And her area, she went from Chicago, they would land sometimes in Cheyenne and then on to California. And some of the stories they've told about flying on those. They had a jump seat, was like a wooden box in the back that the stewardesses got to sit on. But it was very interesting. And she she was also on a swim team, but she ended up with a mastoid infection, and she went back to Northwestern to have surgery. And to make a long story short, after the second surgery, they had cut a muscle in her face. And so she looked like she had Bell's palsy, and she was mortified. And Katie had already come out to Wyoming. So she came out. My mother came out to sort of hide from the world because she was embarrassed because her face was crooked. And I didn't ever notice it because that's all I ever knew. But that's how she came to Worland. She had a friend out there, and so she came out and she met my dad in the 30s, and they were married in 1937.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, I believe you lived in town. Did you want to talk about where you lived?
Yes, we lived, they had just opened up some lots, and it was 909 Grace. And my father was a beekeeper at that time. He was an engineer by trade, but he was a beekeeper and also worked at Holly Sugar. And he bought our lot, and he built a log building with the intention of buying the lot next door to build a house. And that log building was going to be the honey shop. Well, before he could get the lot purchased, Owen Everett bought that lot. And so we had no choice, or they had no choice, but he converted the building he built into a home. And that's where we grew up. We had the same home the whole time I lived there. And if you see it, very close to the alleys, because that part of town all had alleys. And it was wonderful. I mean, we thought it was wonderful because we had a great big huge front yard to play in and had wonderful neighbors. And the house is still there. They added on to it in mid 60s and added the front of it on, and they added quite a bit. But the neighborhood has changed. And I was blessed to live 3 blocks from everywhere. And there were a few houses across the street from us. Alex Haley Jr. and Lorraine were there, and Hugh and Maxine Knofel, and Chuck and Mrs. Gentry. I can't say her first name. Were across from us. Pardon?
Marion Gentry.
Yes, Marion, thank you. And Mr. and Mrs. Bob Gordon were right next to us, and Haynes and Mrs. Hall. And then we had the Reeds. I mean, we were just blessed. And then south of us, there were very few, if any, houses. It was all hayfield. And one at a time, they started coming in. Some of the classmates, they started building homes out that way, and we had the Sanders Park. But like I say, we were 2 or 3 blocks from every place in town. And we never go to Worland that we don't drive by to make sure everything's okay. It's our home.
Now, I remember there's a street named Culbertson. Was that for your family?
Yes, that was both for Roger Culbertson and the one that helped with the canals, and Aunt Mary, I believe, on that one. And the ironic part is we lived on Grace Avenue, which was named after Grace Robertson, and she lived on Culbertson Avenue, which was named after the family.
What do you remember about the area around Worland, what it looked like?
I never thought about it being a small town, because being a small child, it was big to us. But like I said, we were 2 blocks or a block and a half from the park. I went to kindergarten in the basement of a house that was 2 or 3 blocks from us. The high school was 2 blocks. Downtown was about 3 blocks, 2 blocks. And we could ride our bikes everywhere. Everybody was very, very friendly. all except one person, and I'll get to that. But we knew that we were taught to treat people with respect, and we respected their property. And if we were asked to do something, we did it. And I think one of the things I remember that that you don't see today is when somebody older than you came into a room, just out of courtesy and respect, you always stood to recognize their presence and offered them your seat. And I don't know if that came from the military point or just because that's what kids did. And that is one thing I've noticed that doesn't happen anymore. But, and everybody, most of the close friends we called by their first name. Anybody else you met, you always addressed as Mr. or Mrs. or Miss. You never just said, called them by their first name unless you had their permission.
You remember what the downtown street looked like? Main Street?
Yes, I can just almost go down this street and look at the stores. I do. Every store, had big windows in it, and either clothing or things for the drugstore. We had Broadbent and Haley, which I loved, that came in maybe junior high time. We had 2 drugstores that had wonderful fountains, and Reed's had booze, but you could go up and have a soda. They had the apothecary jars at the back where your pharmacist was. We had, let's see, on the one we had the theater and then a barber shop. I can remember where the men got their hair cut. Murr's Bakery, the Outdoorsman. Molly's was one of the nice clothing stores. And the Banks, we had Kelly's shoe store. Gosh, what else was down there? We were blessed. Oh, and Ray's department store. Do you remember Sydney was part of our class, Sydney Colson? Mm-hmm. And her dad, Ray, and Catherine had the little store on the corner, Ray's department store. And we had Gamble's. We had one of the fun stores, the Ben Franklin there on the corner. For a nickel, you could go buy lots of stuff if you had a nickel.
If you had a nickel, right.
And then down the street, going east, there was a little corner market that McPike's had, the little log cabin. And I can remember, if you were lucky, you would find a pop bottle someplace. And if you took it in and you had, I believe, 1 pop bottle, you could exchange it and get a popsicle. And then you could share it with a friend because they were a nickel. Oh, excuse me. Let me turn that phone off. Let me see, can I get over?
Can we move on to the next person now, maybe?
There, I'm sorry. Sorry about that.
How about the areas surrounding Worland?
Oh, the area surrounding Worland. It was mainly fields. We had lots and lots of alfalfa. They raised a lot of beets and beans, a lot of dirt roads. And I recall we had, oh my goodness, excuse me. My husband's not here. Sorry about that. Lot of dirt roads, and I shouldn't tell this, but as soon as we could see over my father's lap, he let us herd the car. And as soon as our feet would reach the pedals for the clutch and brake, we could drive the car on the dirt roads. So we started driving really, really young. But we always were out on the dirt roads out in the middle of nowhere. But the industries we had at that time, we had Holly Sugar on the west side of Worland. We had the sulfur plant eventually out there, and it was about 12 miles out, I believe, out of town, just this side of the county line. And we had a big sheep and cattle industry. a lot of the kids were out on the farm or with ranches. And we spent a lot of time, like I say, up just being outside. And where my dad was a beekeeper, I loved to help him. And I would do my best and go out and help him feed the bees in the early spring or go through the hives, and we'd take the supers off. And the very back room in our house was a honey shop. And we would bring the hives in. He'd smoke the bees out in the bee yard to keep them there and drive them down into the other frames. And then we would bring the supers in and we would extract the honey. And the honey that we sold went to Superior Honey in Denver. And we had a flatbed truck, and about 35, 40 miles an hour, he'd load that truck, and then we'd saunter to Denver. It took us forever to get there, but we'd get there. And then the beeswax, he sold the dregs of the beeswax as he needed it, but he kept the fine beeswax and sold it. And that's what helped us go to college, was that big, beautiful, bright yellow wax off of the bees.
Oh.
And but my father had been state beekeeper for a year or two, and I really enjoyed working with him until I got stung terribly, and then I was a lot more hesitant to go out. But I just remember Worland as being a big open space, and we could ride our bikes everywhere, you know, that we wanted to. We roller skated. You were really in luck if you had roller skates that clamped onto your saddle Oxfords, and you could roller skate around your blocks. And around our block, particularly between 9th and 10th on Grace and Culbertson Avenue, there was a section that we called it the Cook Corner, because Mr. and Mrs. Cook lived there. And as you went across that sidewalk, it was hollow sounding, and we loved that. So you'd skate really fast around the corner and come back, and the sidewalk was hollow. And everybody in town had jump ropes or jacks or roller skates or bikes. We just, you know, we just played, and you felt very safe going out. Worland was a safe community. And I never hesitated. If I needed help with something, you could always ask one of the neighbors. They were more than willing to help, but that worked both ways.
Are we going to go on to the next question with somebody?
Let's go on to the next question. I guess that's Joyce.
Okay. Well, Joni, I'm curious. You have such a fabulous history in Worland, which we could listen to you all day long. But do you have a person that is in your mind that as you were growing up in Worland, you think made the most significant difference in your life in one way or another? Is there a single person that you could think of?
Well, you just stumped me by single. I have several people, but I remember in 8th grade, we were able to have an 8th grade graduation. And they lined us up alphabetically. And when I lined up alphabetically, the person I had to walk down the aisle with in our auditorium probably came to my shoulder, if there. And at that time I was 5'10". I'd gotten my height early. And I was devastated because I looked like the Jolly Green Giant. And it's the first time I'd ever had any high heels, and they must have been ½ an inch. So now I was going to be even taller, and he was going to be shorter. And Miss Sadie Netterbett was a teacher in our junior high, and she was a class sponsor. And I started to cry, and I said, if I have to walk down the aisle with him, I'm not going to graduate. And she looked at me and she said, well, what if we do this? And she switched me with whomever it was, and I don't remember, as we walked down the aisle. And then she said, when you get up there, very quietly switch back so you're not out of order. She made it so simple. And I know he was relieved because he was so short, he didn't get his height till later. And I just remember her compassion as a teacher, because it could have been really traumatic if she had said, well, you're going to stay there. But she made it so easy. And I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to go into teaching, is so many of our teachers made impressions. Mrs. Chastain allowed us as second year shorthand students to go to a court trial that was being held, a change of venue trial, during our senior year. And we got to sit in that trial the entire time and take shorthand notes. The upcoming prosecutor was from Lander at that time. He was county attorney, and it was the upcoming Jerry Spence. And I know most of you have heard of Jerry. He was handsome, debonair, three-piece suit, shiny shoes. And he made us feel like we were the most important people in that courtroom. He would stop and ask us if he was speaking so that we could get his words down correctly. And it just made a real impression on me as a student. And I thought, someday I hope to do that, for students. And I was fortunate as a teacher to be able to take our kids to the courtroom several times to visit the judges and the court reporters and to go through the sheriff's office. And I think those kind of things we had privy to at home affected my desire to carry on their work.
Okay, were there any others other than teachers that are big in your memory?
I think a lot of the scout leaders that we were blessed to have, there was a little house called the Edith Haley Little House. And that was where we got to go to Girl Scouts. And my parents were both very active in scouting. My dad was leader of Troop 3, and my mother was Girl Scout and Boy Scout leader, or Girl Scout leader, excuse me, in Brownies. And those people, I mean, they just, everybody was instrumental in teaching us life skills. And you didn't realize that's what they were doing, but it's the, different survival skills and getting along with people and working with them. But per se, I think my neighbors, and I just feel that we were really lucky to have a lot of older people that lived beside us, and they all were surrogate grandparents, because my grandparents lived in Burlington, Iowa, and we heard, where they wrote letters, and maybe once every 3 or 4 years we would get to see them, but we did not know them that well because we didn't have the ease of traveling. If we got to travel to go back, it's because somebody in the family had died and we had to go to a funeral, or somebody was getting married. And those are the only reasons. And you either drove in a 1940 car or rode the train, which was forever, but that was a fun thing too. If you haven't ever ridden a train, please do before they're gone. They're fun to ride. But that's the only ones I can think of. There were many people, and I think of Ray Colson at the Ray's department store. He and Catherine took us to Denver with him one time on a buying trip. And we got to watch them buy clothes for their store. And they took us down to the Coliseum. And I will never forget, the entertainer was Harry Belafonte. And I can still see him on the stage singing. That was one of my few concerts I've ever been to. That was wonderful.
Okay, thank you, Joni. So who's next for questions?
It would be, were you involved in youth activities, both in school and outside of school? Did you participate in district and state gatherings and competitions? What do you remember about the activities and their importance in your life?
Okay.
Okay, yes, I was always involved. I started out in Brownie Scouts and then sort of transitioned to Girl Scouts. And I did earn my curved bar. That was at that time the highest that you could earn in Girl Scouts. I also belonged to Job's Daughters. And I remember, you know, all the things going to the meetings, what have you. And one of the things I do remember is in high school, we had a Job's Daughters drill team. And that drill team was a marching team. And we'd compete in competitions in Laramie. And I can remember being one of the taller people, and I was always on a corner. And I had a horrible fear of missing one of the orders, you know, like to the rear arch or something, and I'd be going the wrong way. I used to have nightmares about that. But we learned to march in high school band. So I participated in band. I believe Basil Broadbent was the first band instructor I had in 5th grade, I believe. Excuse me. And I started playing the saxophone. And my grandfather thought that was terrible because saxophones to him meant a honky tonk. That's where they had it in the jazz honky tonk, but he soon got over that. And when I got into high school, Mr. Collier asked me if I would play the oboe. So I started playing the oboe my sophomore year in high school. And I was involved with Miss Stuka and Thespians. And that was always fun. I always loved to do the props and that type of thing and be behind the scenes, but she could not get me to be on the stage. I just wouldn't do that. She tried. And I said, if I have to be on stage, I won't be a thespian. So she said, okay, that didn't work. Excuse me. And to think I used to talk for hours on end, and now I can't talk that long. But what was the other question? And work. I also started working the summer of 1956. I worked for Velte's paint store, and I sold paint. I never did learn how to mix. I didn't want that. I watched it, but I, you know, stocked shelves and dusted and greeted customers. And then I had the opportunity to go to work at the A&W later that summer. And the A&W was one of our happening drive-ins. And Sam Gibson was the owner at the time. And I absolutely loved it. I worked there all through high school in the summers. We usually started sometimes just before school was out or right after school was out, and we worked until about a week after school. Excuse me. And then after I graduated from high school, I came back 2 different summers and worked at the A&W. Many wonderful memories about jerkin root beer, and I ended up being the cook. Claire Matheson was a head cook right there. She'd been there since it first opened, and she was there for many, many years. But got to work with some wonderful people there.
Was
At
it
the A&W.
hot dogs and hamburgers that you were?
Yes, our menu was very simple. We had hot dogs, hamburgers, twin burgers, and on Fridays we had egg salad and tuna salad. We served root beer and A&W orange, and ice cream cones and malts and shakes, and then French fries. And that was basically the whole menu. If you didn't want a hamburger, hot dog, you didn't go to the A&W. The other drive-ins, we had Wilson's Drive-In, and do you remember Slurp and Burp?
Oh, yeah.
And the Slurp and Burp was actually a cafe, and I believe Wilson's where you could go in, but they also both had a very simple drive-in. But those were the only drive-ups we had, and the A&W root beer was new and unique. The root beers cost 5 cents, a dime, and a quarter for they had the babies, the regulars, and then the big.
And how much were you paid an hour? You remember?
Well, at the A&W, I think I started at, it was either 35 or 50 cents an hour, because I was above the babysitting wage. It started by babysitting. I did a lot of babysitting, and we started out at about a quarter an hour babysitting, if that. Sometimes they just give you 50 cents for the night or $1, whatever, but you still had a little pocket change. And I finally got up to about $1.25 an hour, I think, after.
Oh, you
yeah.
were making a big time.
Yes. Which makes me think the first year I taught school, I made $3,200 the first year. And that was a real eye opener. And one of the things I realized is whenever you were home and you opened a cupboard, you had soap, you had rags. We didn't have paper towels much, if at all. And when I got my own house, my own apartment, my cupboards were bare. And it took me a long time, that realization of, oh my gosh, I have 2 plates and a glass and a fork, and I do have a stove and a couple pots. And eventually you gather all those things. But even though I'd grown up cooking with my mom, I just never thought about having to start out on my own when there was nothing there. So those are some rude awakenings children have.
But you survived with your cooking skills from home in the A&W.
Yes, yes. And every once in a while, I still do like a glass of root beer or root beer float.
Joni, did you belong to a church youth group? Do you remember how Wednesday nights were spent in
Yes.
church youth groups? Did this influence
Yes.
your friendships?
I think it really did. I belonged to the Methodist Church. I was baptized there, and we had a wonderful choir. Our high school music teacher was also our choir director, and our choir, we were blessed to have many kids in our class that were in the choir, and they harmonized beautifully. I have a 2-note range and they're both off key. And so at one time, Mr. Collier told me, it's all right if you mouth the words. And if I had a strong alto beside me, I could follow it. But we really had a lot of fun as the choir, but we belonged to the Methodist Youth Fellowship, the MYF. And we did go to girls' church camp up there at the Circle J, which also makes me think of one other interesting thing is when I was a Girl Scout, we go to the Buffalo Bill camp out of Cody. That was where the Girl Scouts went to camp. And we were up there one year, and this gentleman and his daughter drove into the Girl Scout camp and introduced himself to our leaders and offered to entertain us that evening. And it was Edgar Bergen and his daughter Candace. And he told us that Charlie McCarthy and Mortimer Snurd, which were his 2 puppets, had been very naughty, and they were at reform school because they were being refurbished, actually. But so he took his hand and like this and put eyes on it and a scarf over it, and he used that as his puppet. And he entertained us all evening with that silly puppet, one on each hand, and just made up all kinds of stories. But Candace was also a young lady. And if you know Candace Bergen now, she's not a young lady anymore. She's aged like the rest of us. That was such a memory to have up there, to have him just stop in at the youth camp. He saw it and thought he could, if we were interested. And I have a good memory of him as well.
What a memory for a Wyoming kid.
Yes.
Yeah.
And do any of you remember the old cars we drove? When we went to scout camp, we had a Packard, and walruses, the ones that had the, is that how you say it, the beanery, the elevator, had a Packard. And the more weight you put in the trunk, it had a leveling mechanism. And so it would make it, instead of like our car, which would just keep getting lower, their trunk would even out. And I just thought that was fascinating because they would always load up a bunch of kids to go to scout camp, and it didn't seem to matter how much weight you put in the back end of the car, it would level itself out. That's a neat feature of the old Packards. And we had an old work car, 1948 Ford, that was a fun car just to drive. It, you know, was a stick shift, so you had to know how to get through it. We didn't have anything automatic at that time, so you learned to drive with a clutch, which I wish more people knew how to do. And we didn't have a standard car, I don't think, the whole time that, or an automatic the whole time I was growing up.
Worland was the 8th largest city in Wyoming when we grew up. Its population more than doubled because of the oil boom. What are your memories of our small town growing? We continually had new classmates from other places, new houses being built, new businesses opening, 2 flights a day to Denver. How did living with growth and more growth impact your adult outlook?
That's a big question. I did not realize that we were in an oil boom growing up. Looking back, I, can see that now, but people were just there. And we had friends whose fathers worked in the oil industry. And my father had always worked with his hands, and I just didn't think anything about it. As far as new houses, the house we grew up in was an older house, and all the houses south of us were newer. Everybody had newer houses, and it was always fun to go there. But we loved our little log house because it was the warmest house in the winter and the coolest in the summer. It was so well chinked, and we did have to oil logs, but I never thought about the impact of kids coming in. And I remember Joyce came in and she just assimilated. Joan, when you came, I didn't know you hadn't been there forever. You just are part of everybody. And I was either blessed or cursed, never having moved to a different town, because I never knew a stranger. I didn't know how to have to meet people until I was out of college, or actually in college. But even in college, there were a couple dozen of us that went to the University of Wyoming. So no matter where you went, you knew somebody. The girls all lived in one dorm at the university, the freshman girls, but we all agreed to have different roommates so that we got to know their roommates, and that's how you met people. But as far as Worland, we had bikes you could ride everywhere. We had airplanes coming in and out all the time. I never thought about it being unique or different. Having lived in different towns at this time, I can see where Worland was unique. I remember the Christmas tree that they used to put up, which many towns don't have. And they had for Friday after Thanksgiving, they'd have a downtown parade, and Santa would come, and Worland would turn all the Christmas lights on, and the stores would stay open from that Saturday on through Christmas, and they would stay open from like 5 to 9 every night. And so, it was just something that I thought was absolutely wonderful, because people had time to go downtown and shop. You walk downtown. A lot of people didn't have cars, so you just walked and enjoyed everybody. And that was a wonderful memory that we did have of Worland, was all the celebrations and the Christmas festivities.
Joanne, where did you teach?
I taught business, and when I first started, I taught all the shorthand, the typing, accounting, business law, any of those subjects. But in, oh gosh, it was probably the early 90s, I could see the handwriting on the wall and knew that if I did not get further education and start teaching computers or learning about them, I wouldn't have a job. So I started a master's degree and have received a master's in computer education. And then I was teaching computers. And the way we had it set at school, I taught applications. We had somebody that taught programming. That was not my bailiwick, so I still don't like to program. So I taught applications and absolutely loved it.
Where was it that you taught?
In Riverton,
Oh,
I
okay.
started teaching. My first job was probably one of my very most memorable, and I started November 15th. I had ended up messing myself up by changing majors a couple of times. So I had to do student teaching in the fall. And I started teaching in a small town out of Laramie called Rock River. And I was terrified because I have never been any place that I didn't know 2/3 of the people or all the people. And I knew nobody. And I fell in love with that community. And I stayed there 2 years. And I knew that if I didn't leave that year, I never would.
Wow.
Because that was such a wonderful community. Everybody opened their hearts, their homes, and their arms. And I just loved it. We had a schoolhouse that was built around the gym. Every classroom came off of the gym. And so when you walked out the door, you were actually in the gym on sort of a boardwalk that went around the gym. And they had a stage on one end, and that's their community center. It was a wonderful experience. And after I left Rock River, I went to Green River, and I absolutely loved the school and the teachers and the kids. But I found the town was not as quite as accepting because you were a teacher and you were on a different, they felt you were on a different level than they were. And I had never experienced that before. I was blessed to have an education, and many of them as minors didn't. And yet when you were invited to their homes, they were warm and welcoming. But on the street, they hesitated to speak because they didn't know if you would know them. And it was so different from my experience in Rock River that I only stayed there 1 year, and then I went to Lander to teach. And I taught there for 3 or 4 years, and before I met my husband, and then married, and we moved out to the dairy farm. So I finished that year, and then the next year I taught in Riverton and stayed there.
Joni, in closing, for the generations to come that might listen to your story years in the future, is there any wisdom that you want to pass on to them that you think you learned growing up in Worland?
I think in retrospect, growing up in Worland made me aware of the good in people. And so I would just say, as you're going through life, enjoy it day by day. And life is really, truly a journey. It's not a destination. So take each day, live it to the fullest, and, create new friendships. There's always somebody out there that needs a smile. It might be the only one they get, that needs a hello. And if you do your part, others will do theirs. I just think you need to put your face to the sun and keep looking forward.
That's a wonderful thought and wonderful for all of us, Joni. Thank you so much. You are a treasure for us all, and I am
Yes.
so appreciative. So thank you again.
Well, thank you. I feel that way about all of you, and we were blessed to have been in Worland. I really think that.
This is Joan Purcell, Joan Walseth Purcell, talking with Joanne Culbertson Jeffres on May 18th, 2022. We're going to add a little information to her interview because we thought of some things we'd like to hear from her. So Joanne, you want to tell us a little bit more about your father?
Yes, we had talked about the wartime, and as World War II began escalating, my father, Bill Culbertson, as he was known, tried to re-enlist, but he was told that he was needed as a beekeeper because it was considered a vital or essential to the war effort. Sugar was in very short supply. They couldn't buy it from the other countries as they had been to supplement the sugar raised in the United States. And honey was needed to replace that as a sweetener, as well as the beeswax, which was vital to the war effort. There are so many facets that it was needed in the military. It was used to coat their airplane wings to make them fly faster, to coat shells and their drill bits, cables, pulleys, anything like that. It was impervious to the heat or to the cold. Beeswax was also used as a waterproofer. They covered all their tents with it, all their ropes. The string was made stronger by running it through the beeswax so that it would last longer in all their military equipment. And even though the premium wax or the fine yellow wax was used for many things, they found out that they could use the scrapings from the honeycombs or the second and third course honey, but it was taken care of, and that's what the beekeepers provide. And millions of pounds of beeswax was provided to the military for those purposes. Even the canteens, anything that needed to be waterproofed. So my dad did not go back to the service. He maintained his career as a beekeeper, and also worked at Holly Sugar during the campaigns. Most of the time during my life, he was a year-round worker at the Holly Sugar as well as a beekeeper. One of the other things my father was very, very passionate about was teaching young men life skills, skills they may not have learned on their own or from their own fathers. And he was adamant about working with Boy Scouts. Fire by flint and steel, by friction, you name it. He taught kids how to camp, how to rough it. Since he had roughed it all of his life, he was on his own a lot and very much a military person. But his main passion was swimming. And he was a Red Cross water safety instructor for Washakie County. And many, many, many years, he took boys and of course a carload of girls, since he had the two of us, to Thermopolis swimming at the Star Plunge every Friday night. It didn't matter if it was 100 above or 40 below. We would pack up in that old 48 Ford we had, or the old Packard, whichever we had at the time. And there are many men involved. Ted Hanner, for one. His daughter Lonnie was in our class. Les Kimsey, Lou Tuttle, many men that were Boy Scout leaders, and would just go to Thermopolis, and we would have an hour to an hour and a half of hard swimming and with different lessons. And then they always allowed us to play for half an hour to an hour afterwards. And one of the fun things I remember is when it was 20 below outside, we could hardly wait to get out of the inside pool, skinny over the ice, and get into the outside pool because it was so foggy with all the ice in the cold, but it was fun to swim outside when it was that cold. Then the hard part was getting up over the ice bank back into the inside pool to warm up again. But my dad knew no strangers. And even after he had retired from teaching the boys to swim, if he saw you in a swimming pool, and he would work his way over to somebody that looked like they were struggling, and much to my mother's chagrin, because she would be embarrassed, my dad all of a sudden was teaching them how to swim because they were afraid. And before he got done, he had them floating or swimming or at least comfortable in the water. He just figured it was such a survival skill that everybody should know how to do it. And that's one of the things that we learned, and we just took for granted that everybody knew how to swim. And that's not the case. And both my sister and I had earned our life-saving badges and had worked as, my sister had worked as a lifeguard at the pool. I never did work as a lifeguard, but I did have. I'm certainly not certified anymore. But I just did want to mention all of that, the things that he had done in his life other than work, because his scouting was so important to him.
That's a nice story.
Well, thank you. He
Um,
was a strong-willed man, and thinking back to, he and one of the other fellows developed the shooting range out of Worland. With his military connections, he was able to get the tank steel, and they cut the turkey and the deer and the hog, the wild boar, all of those things out of tank steel, and made a shooting range out there near the fairgrounds. That was one of his other passions, is we learned to hunt and shoot guns very early so that we could survive, or just for pleasure in shooting skeet. You know, we shoot the clay pigeons quite a bit.
I didn't know about that range. Did you, Kathy?
I didn't. Did
And
you ever
I'm
go
sure-
shoot? Did you ever go shooting, Joni? Like
I
real
did. My
shooting?
dad used to take us out to one of the mobile oil dumps, and they had like cans and things there. So he'd set them up on something, and we would shoot those.
Mhm. I used to shoot quite a bit with him. We'd target practice an awful lot, and we shot a lot of skeet where you throw the clay pigeons and
Mm.
shoot with a shotgun. I haven't since my adult years. I've had no reason or time to, but I still do have the original 22 my dad gave me.
My brother,
about
my
the
brother
time-
had,
What about the time you went hunting with him, real hunting?
That did not go real well. I knew I was ready to go hunting, and we were up with Bill Four, who I always called Uncle Bill, on top of the mountain. And they saw a deer, and as they got out of the truck and were preparing to bear down on him, I yelled, "Run!" Needless to say, that was the last time I was asked to go hunting. There's no way I could kill anything. I love to shoot targets, but I don't have the heart to kill anything that's living, other than maybe a spider. I can't even handle a mouse. So
Now-
he failed me on that one, or I failed him. He didn't fail me, because I know I could have hit it, but there's no way I would have.
Is there anything else that you'd like to mention that you didn't talk about the other day? Kathy made some comment that you might want to mention something about some of the personalities of some of your relatives. Do you have any stories about them?
You know, I wish I could say I did, but I remember all the family stories. My dad was a fabulous storyteller. I wish I had his knack. I remember Aunt Mary only from stories, because she moved back to St. Louis probably in the late 40s, maybe 47, 46. I'm not sure when she went back to St. Louis, but I know that my dad's aunt, who was his matriarch in his life, and his grandmother were both in St. Louis, and Aunt Mary passed away there in 1950. So I truly do not remember as other than just the stories. And they were, very colorful, as my dad could make any character. But he was an avid reader. And if he wrote you a letter, he didn't write a paragraph or two, he wrote an epic. That was just him. And I wish I had all of his writings because he was very eloquent. And mother was much quieter. They made quite a pair, but as her career as a nurse, and mainly remembered as a school nurse, but she too had worked at the hospital with Dr. Andy and helped Zelda Black with some of the public health. And she and Louise were so involved, Louise Hampton were so involved in the strep throat program in the state. And my sister Marilyn did have scarlet fever, and knowing what that could do is one of the reasons that they were so adamant that they wanted to see if they couldn't help stop scarlet fever from getting a hold of young people by getting strep throat stopped in its tracks. So with a strep throat swab, if you tested positive, you would just simply go get your antibiotics or your medication from the doctors. And that program was very viable throughout the state of Wyoming for many years. And anymore they will do a swab, but they don't do it on routine like Worland did. But when mother was at the schools, she covered 7 schools in Worland before she retired.
Ew.
And she retired in, I believe it was 1972. So they kept her busy. Other than that, I can't think of anything other than the fact that I think all of us were very blessed to have been raised in Worland. Did it have its problems? I'm sure it did. But as a child growing up there, I didn't see those problems. I was very protected or sheltered. And yet we had the freedom to do most anything that we wanted to do. But with my parents, you were allowed to explore and do what you wanted, but they always set limits and consequences. So if you chose to do something, you would be responsible to pay the consequence, no matter what that was. And sometimes it wasn't worth having done it after you paid the consequence. But my folks allowed us to have sort of a free hand at doing that. And Worland gave us a great place to grow up.
I think that was something more of the parents of our generation wanting their kids to be responsible, or most of them did. I think we've seen a change in that, with parents wanting kids to be so happy all the time.
Right.
How many streets in Worland are named after people from your family?
Just Culbertson. And then Helen Howell, or Helen Coburn Howell, was a very dear friend of my Aunt Mary. And she and Aunt Helen and Aunt Mary were young ladies, very well schooled young ladies, when they came out in the stagecoach from Iowa. They were not related by blood, just by friendship, is my understanding. But she was always known as Aunt Helen, just as Bill Four was Uncle Bill.
What's your favorite story your father used to tell about your Aunt Mary Culbertson?
I think just there is no one story. It's just how tall she was, how striking, how ambitious, and she had set her goals and coming out to the West to homestead and to try to improve things. Other than that, I don't have a story. I just remember she and Helen had been such close friends that when they homesteaded, they did build that house so that it went across the homestead line between the two places. So they both could show an improvement on their homestead within that homestead period, because they had built a building. And that way they would still be able to live together under one roof and help protect themselves from the wilds out there in the countries. But they just had a lot of, I don't know, gumption. What do you call it? The strength of character to go out and face the unknown. It's sort of like a little town girl or little city girl going to the big city today. You have to have faith in people. And if you listen to today's news, it's sort of shattered. Where we listen to the radio, do you remember, who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of man? The shadow knows. I remember listening to the radio with my grandparents and the music. And I was talking to Lowell Peterson, and I asked him if he knew anything about the coconuts. And he said, yes, he and Punky had been a coconut. I said, you are the only person I know that knows what a coconut is in Worland. It was a dance group.
Yeah.
My parents belonged to the Coconuts, and several times a year they had these dances in the old community hall where they would have a live band and they would dance, and a couple times a year they had a formal dance, a dinner and a dance. And that was something that they, even though my dad was big and awkward, mom used to love to go out dancing. And that's something that I don't know if Worland has anymore, is a group like that that just enjoys an evening of music and dancing. Those are some of the little quirks that many people don't know about my father, who seemed to be very gruff on the outside, but he was a teddy bear inside.
I'm curious about what happened to the homestead.
My father had it for years, and then Marilyn and I had it, but since we lived up in Fremont County, we were unable to take care of it, so it was sold. And I believe that Vigils have it now, or Vigils. I think it's the Vigil family out toward Manderson.
Interesting.
Yes.
So it was in the family for like 3 generations.
Yes. I don't know if I have anything else to add. I just appreciate the opportunity to let people know that we were blessed to have a wonderful community and wonderful parents. And they did leave their footprint in Worland. And for years to come, it will still be there as Culbertson Avenue. And there are so many, many people in Worland that do have a link to the history. Mine just happens to go back to the early 1900s.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you,
Yes.
Kathy, for recording this. Thank you, Joanne, for all of your information. And I think people will enjoy this.
Well, thank you.
So Joni, you've talked about your mother and her career as the school nurse. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that involved?
I'd be happy to. My mother, Sally Culbertson, was the school nurse in Worland from about 1947, 48. I'm not sure when she was hired, until 1972. And during her time, she covered all the schools. Eventually, there were 7 schools in Worland that she covered, but she could see a rise in strep throat. And strep throat can be easily detected by a throat swab. And if strep throat is untreated, it will eventually go into scarlet rheumatic fever, which will lead to scarlet fever. So Mother worked closely with the doctors in town and a lab technician named Louise Hampton, one of our other mothers in Worland. And Louise worked with Mom and they developed a strep throat program. So every few weeks or once a month, everybody in school was tested for strep throat, or on a need be cases if they came in with a sore throat. And by detecting, reading the augurs, everything, the blood augurs that they did, Louise did all of that. They were able to get medication to the children on a very quick turnaround so that they could prevent the strep throat from advancing into rheumatic fever, which would go into the scarlet fever, as I mentioned. And they both can damage the heart and cause lifetime issues. So I just wanted to mention that not only did they do this in Worland, but Mom was very involved with the State School Nursing Association, and they got these throat swabs and the strep throat program going throughout the state in many schools. Today's school system no longer does the strep throat analysis like they used to. They have more rapid tests, but they're requiring, if the child does come with a sore throat, they require the parents to go get a strep test. The schools no longer do them. And I just thought it was a wonderful thing that she had done through the school system there. One of the other people in town that needs to be recognized is Zelda Black. And Zelda was also the county nurse that helped whenever they needed an immunization program throughout the school. She was always available to Mom, as was Louise Hampton.
I remember one time when we were maybe in the 6th grade, 6th or 7th, Judy Van Busker's class, there was maybe a polio outbreak, and the kids all had to have gamma globulin shots that were so painful that Judy couldn't go down to her basement bedroom because it was too painful to walk down the steps, because you got it in your, I think you got it in your rump. Your mother must have been involved in that. Do you remember that?
I don't remember I remember the polio outbreak, and we had several young of our friends that were, had polio, but they used to have the drops that they did on the sugar cubes that we took that were to help prevent polio. And I think that if you test, I don't remember everybody getting the gamma globulin. I think it was those that maybe have had a positive test. I'd have to research that. I don't remember, but yeah, she was involved in trying to prevent a lot of these through the schools. Tick shots were another thing that were around. We had a big outbreak of tick fever in Washakie County. And so the public health nurse, Zelda Black, would come up, and I remember everybody getting tick shots. It required a series of 3 in their first year, and then the next year, I think it was 2. And then after that, it was a yearly booster. And they would do those through the school. And those are the things that are no longer done. They're through the school systems. They're all done, privately with your own physician. But at that time, it was such a boon to everybody to have this available. And so the school nurse not only just took care of the kids if they had a medical problem or fell and needed medical attention, they also helped with a lot of the immunizations clinics. And so they were very busy. And as Worland grew and added more schools, Mom had one school where it was her main office, and that was the old junior high. And then each day she would make a point of checking in there and then spending hours at, one day a week at the different schools. So she traveled all the time and never really had one place that she had to be, except she, had a routine, and she'd go around to all the different schools. And then if they needed her, if a child had fallen or was sick, she would hurry up and go over there. And now most schools have their own school nurse, or a nurse will cover maybe 2 schools at the most. But it was a full-time job. She had worked at the hospital for years and years, and when this opportunity came, she thought it would be wonderful because having 2 children in school, it made life much easier to have her weekends off and her summers to go back and get more education like the teachers did.
When you think about rheumatic fever, didn't your older sister Marilyn have rheumatic fever? Was this before or after this program?
I wish I had thought about the year, but Marilyn had ended up with scarlet fever. And at that time, they quarantined everybody in the family. My mom couldn't go to work. We had to stay home, and my dad could go to work, but no place else. And that is the same year that Worland had the ice jam. And I remember that because the ice was up on that old bridge. I don't know if you remember that, but in the springtime when the ice started coming down the river and it was breaking up, it actually came up on that old bridge on Culbertson Avenue and damaged the bridge a little bit. And I was very upset with my sister because we were quarantined and it was her fault that I couldn't go see the ice jam. But that night, I should know what year that is, but she was very young. But yeah, she had scarlet fever, and we were, at that time, we were all quarantined to the house. And very seldom do they quarantine people anymore, except they did for, they asked that you quarantine for COVID, but you don't hear that like they used to with scarlet fever. But yes, she was affected. No permanent damage, thank goodness.
Joni, thank you so much.
You are so
Really
welcome,
enjoyed
Kathy.
this, and thank you for participating in a public recording for the Warshke Museum.
Thank you.